Jerry. The problem about being the first in a sequence of 3 speakers over 3 years is that by the time we do get to the general election, you'll have all forgotten about me. Well, Jerry sent this invitation to me in November, I think it was, and I was very happy to accept, not least because Mayo, in recent times anyway, has not been the most productive territory as far as the Labour Party is concerned, and I thought it would provide me with an opportunity of doing a little proselytising. And when I accepted the invitation, I was very glad to. I don't think any of us could have imagined then that the time or week that I would actually be talking here would be one where the public service is in the eye, very much in the eye of the economic storm. We are, I think, now at the early stages of what is probably the worst economic crisis in living memory. A few months ago, when most of us would talk about the economic situation, people would say, well, this isn't the 1980s. I remember the 1980s. I was a trade union official during the 1980s. My paths and Peter's crossed regularly during the 1980s. And I would have to say, I think when people would say this is not the 1980s, I think what they meant by that is it's not as bad as the 1980s. I think I'd have to say this is not the 1980s, because in my opinion right now, the 1980s doesn't even begin to fathom the depth of the type of economic crisis we're in at the moment. We're in a scary place right now. And it's a place that is a crisis, I think, that is both global and national. It's global, first of all, because I think what we're seeing is the first global crisis in global capitalism. And we've never been here before. There's never been a crisis of this kind before. And even the great minds, economic commentators, many of them Nobel Prize winners, are just making a stab at where this is going to go. Because what we may be seeing is probably, I suppose, what must be the inevitable consequence of globalization. And that is that if you globalize everything, economy, communications, it follows that at some point there is going to be some kind of a realignment in terms of living standards and incomes and economic activity. You can't go on in a globalized world with one part of the world having the levels of income and living standards that we enjoy in the developed world, while others are on $1 a day. And we may well be at the beginning of something that is much more profound and much more deep than we have seen for a very long time. And I don't think anybody knows quite where that is going to go. The second dimension of the crisis that we have, because that was going to hit us anyway, is that, of course, while the crisis may have started in Wall Street, it got much worse by the time it got to Kildare Street. And the reason for that, of course, is that for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to rehearse here tonight, this country allowed its economy to become over-dependent on construction, on speculative activity in property, on unsustainable borrowing, and as we now know, on some very dodgy practices that went on in our banking system. Now, I say that the people who have been in government for quite some time in this country bear responsibility for that. And I'm simply going to leave it at that for tonight. I'm not going to make an overtly party political speech about this tonight. But what has happened is that the first casualties of all of this have been the people who are losing their jobs and who are about to, and whose businesses are going to the wall. We have seen over the last year the most dramatic rise in unemployment that this country has ever seen. It's more than doubled. I was looking at the figures for Mayo on my way down. And the numbers of people on the live register, Claremorris, Westport, Ballinrobe, have almost trebled since the time of the general election. In the month of January, as we know, 36,500 people were added to the dole queues in this country. All people who, up to last year, good jobs, reasonable incomes, and thought they had hope for the future. And now these people are to be found, see them, queuing along, I saw them in Dunleary, my own constituency, queuing along Cumberland Street, outside the dole office, bewildered by the fact that this is their first time, in many cases, that they've had to encounter or ask the state for assistance of any kind. Embarrassed by the situation that they're in, and frightened for the future. And I believe that the position that we're in at the moment, that it is those loss of jobs, the closure of business, the decline in consumer activity, the overall downturn in economic activity, that is causing the crisis and the problem in the public finances, not the other way around. And that therefore the solution to dealing with the problems in the public finances is by getting the economy moving again. And that is why the Labour Party has been calling for some time for the development of a national recovery plan, a roadmap, if you like, to get us out of the economic recession, which would be centred on jobs, getting the economy moving again, and getting the economy stimulated again. And I've been putting forward some ideas as to how that might be done. Some of it in the area of construction, some of it in the area of the education and training area. And I'm quite pleased, in fact, that some of the suggestions that we've been putting forward are now beginning to be taken up by government. I was very pleased yesterday, for example, to see the idea of the national insulation scheme that was announced by government. That was something that the Labour Party has been suggesting for some time. I welcome the fact that that is being taken up. And the reason that I believe that how we get through this economic recession is by putting the emphasis on jobs, is that if you look at what is happening, every job that is lost in the economy, and I asked questions about this over the past couple of weeks, costs €20,000 minimum to the public finances, between social welfare payments that have to be paid out and lost tax revenue. And that's without taking into account the secondary benefits like rent allowance or mortgage interest subsidy. So if you take January alone, the cost to the Exchequer for the additional 36,500 people who went onto the live register in January is €730 million. That's more than half what the government plans to recover in the pension levy that Peter has just been talking about. And if you take that unemployment may rise to 400,000 by the end of this year, and the Taoiseach and the Dáil last week acknowledged that it would rise to 400,000 by the end of this year. That's another $2 billion that has to be found in cuts of some kind. And that is why I disagree, and the Labour Party disagrees, with the fixation that there has been over the past number of months with just cutting the expenditure side. Now, I accept, of course, that the expenditure side has to be addressed, and I accept that the public finances have to be restored to order. But if you concentrate exclusively on just cutting on the expenditure side, without getting the economy recovered, you have 36,000 extra in January, that's 730 million that you have to find, 400,000 by the end of the year, that's another 2 billion, and on it goes, until eventually you get to a point where you cannot cut anymore. So recovery of the economy, in my view, has to start with getting the economy rebooted, saving jobs, getting people back to work. And as I said, that's not to ignore the fact that the public finances has to be addressed. And it doesn't mean that those who work in the public services do not have a part to play in that, or are not unwilling to play their part. Well, what I believe that many public servants are understandably saying this week is that they didn't create the problem, and that therefore they should not be singled out for unfair treatment as if public servants were the whole problem. I think there is an irony that this week nurses and teachers and guards and county council workers and health service workers are being asked to pay more to a pension fund, half of which is about to be turned over to the recapitalisation of the banks. All over this country, the pain for the economic recession is being borne by working people who are losing their jobs or who are at risk of losing their jobs, by those in businesses which are going to the wall, and by those who now have to pay an extra pension levy, on top of an income levy, top of a pay pause, on top of reduced tax relief for medical expenses, top of the mortgage and the childcare, and who will probably be faced with an increase in tax by the end of the year. Now, I believe that the vast majority of people, including public servants, are willing to play their part in getting the country through the recession. But people need to see the roadmap. We need, as I have said, a recovery plan which describes where we will be at the end of the recession and how we're going to get there. And that recovery plan needs also to set out that everybody will contribute and play their part in getting us through the recession according to their means. And that means that there can be no more hiding place for tax exiles or for those with good accountants who can find every tax loophole and tax shelter to avoid paying their fair share of tax. I think that the framework that needs to be put in place now is a new national agreement for economic recovery, negotiated not just between government and social partners, but also involving wider society. It needs to be a genuinely national agreement. I think it is an agreement that should be framed over a 3-year period at least, and address all of the big issues: jobs, pay, tax, public services. That way, I think we will all know where we stand and avoid the kind of incremental approach that has characterised matters to date. Because the difficulty, I think, that most people have at this moment is that, you see the levy coming in the budget, income levy in the budget, the pension levy comes in the new year, you hear there's going to be tax in the next budget, they might reintroduce student fees. And there isn't a family in the country that can now budget for their own domestic expenditure over the course of the next year or more. And because people can't budget and can't plan, that in turn is affecting consumer activity, because if you don't know where you're going to be at the end of the year, you're unlikely to do the kind of things you might normally have done at the beginning of the year, changing the car or arranging the holiday or whatever it might be, and it all becomes part of the downward spiral. I believe also that if there is a genuinely national agreement for recovery, I think it will avoid the kind of scapegoating that has taken place to date. There has, I believe, been an orgy of scapegoating against workers in the public service over the past number of months, which has enabled the government to make the kind of unilateral decisions that were announced last week. Setting worker against worker is an old strategy which has been used by establishments down the generations, and I must say that I find it as unacceptable to be setting private sector worker against public sector worker as I would have found it unacceptable to have Catholic worker set against Protestant worker in the Belfast of the 1920s. It is, in my view, a form of economic sectarianism. But it seems to me that it is working. Jerry said, wanted to hear where I stood in relation to impact and your members. I'd like to consider myself a friend. But I think there are times when, if you're a friend, you have to say things that perhaps aren't always the popular thing to say. So let me say this as a friend. I think that public service workers have been taking a hammering in the media over the past number of months, and I think as a consequence, you're now taking a hammering in your net incomes. And I say this because I believe in public services. I believe that there are things, water, education, health, infrastructure, that should be provided publicly and be accessible by all. That's part of my political philosophy of the Labour Party. I value public service. I think that to serve the public, to work for the public, is a very noble thing. whether it is done by somebody who's elected to public office as I am, or done by you who's employed by a public authority to work on behalf of the public, or whether it is done voluntarily by the kind of people who go out and train football teams on a Saturday morning, or do so much of the other voluntary public service work that is done in our community. And therefore, I value and I respect public servants. But to defend yourselves now as employees, and to defend the services that you deliver to the public, I think that you're going to need allies and friends among the general public. I think that you will need to reverse some of the unfair and unjustified public perceptions of the public service. This, therefore, I believe, is not a time to use, perhaps, some of the industrial relations instruments that you have used, perhaps successfully, in the past. I think this is a time for convincing and persuading a wider public that what you do is valuable, to explain the importance of it, and to win friends. Because it is very easy for people who are worried about their own jobs and about their own businesses and their own futures to fall for the kind of propaganda that has been perpetrated against you and your colleagues over the past number of months. It is also, I think, necessary to do that, because I think that in order for this country to get through the kind of economic times that we are now in, I think there is going to have to be a genuine pulling together. I think that this is a time not for one sector of workers to be set against another sector of workers, or to begrudge what one has and the other doesn't have. I believe it is a time for unity among working people, whether they work in the public or the private sector. I think it's a time for understanding each other's fears and risks, for refusing to be divided, for determining that we can come out of this recession to a better place. I welcomed some of the things that the Taoiseach said last Thursday evening. I welcomed them because they were things that the Labour Party had been saying for some time. But there is one thing that he said that I disagree with very fundamentally. He said that the future might not be as good for our children as it is for us. And I don't agree with it. I think that is defeatist talk. I think that the future can be better for our children. But it can be better, I believe, in a way that is measured not necessarily in material things or in consumer goods, but by the quality of life, by whether our society is fair, whether we can access health service and education services, and whether our economy is going and our ecology is going to be sustainable into the future. I think we are heading for a very rocky ride over the next few years. But I think that if there is a sense that where we are going to be at the end of that period of time is going to be better than where we are now, that there will again be a prosperous, growing economy, but that can be coupled with more fairness in society, with a better balance between the things that we need as human beings and the things that we need as workers and that we demand in the economy, that it can be a better place. But let us be under no illusion. This is going to be a rocky ride. And I think that in order for us to do that, it has to be done, first of all, in a way that we know where we're going. And I think that that is not the case at the moment. That is why I believe the National Recovery Plan is so important. And secondly, it is a journey that is going to have to be travelled fairly, where everybody does their fair share, contributes their fair share, and where there is a general acceptance across society that everybody is playing their part, that no sector is being victimised or being asked to carry too much, and that we all do it together. And I hope that in the course of time, that I will have the opportunity, as leader of the Labour Party, of playing my part of leading that effort in government.